When Donald Trump, at the very last minute, hit the big red pause button on tariffs against Canada and Mexico, there were two kinds of reactions.
Trump got rolled by both of these countries, and no one, least of all Trump, seems to have realized it.
Canada tried to hold out and just ended up begging for mercy. So far, every country that's been threatened bent the knee, and we haven't conceded a thing.
But what both angles miss is the underlying truth, which is this isn't over.
Donald Trump hasn't said anything is permanently gone.
Take Canada as an example. Yes, Donald Trump said this country is finally taking its border seriously. Yes, he nodded to its big billion-dollar concession, the appointment of a fentanyl czar, listing drug cartels as terrorists. He's very pleased. But then, at the very end, the tariffs announced on Saturday will be paused for a 30-day period to see whether or not a final economic deal with Canada can be structured. At which point, it's like, wait, economic deal? What are we talking about? Wasn't this about fentanyl and illegal immigration and border security? But now the tariffs are explicitly contingent on more than just that.
So in 30 days, is he going to ask for more concessions on the economy? What happens in
What's
30
the boss's three favorite words? You know what's it. Let's see what happens, right?
Then you remember, oh right, there are still all of Trump's other grievances.
We have a tremendous deficit with Canada.
We don't need them to make our cars. We don't need them to give us lumber.
We subsidize Canada by the tune of about $200 billion a year. And for what?
They rely on our military.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
And that leaves us with the task of trying to disentangle each thing from the other. Because how does a country like Canada negotiate when the goalposts keep moving? And what does Trump even really want?
Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
Trump has repeated this claim that Canada bears some responsibility for the drug overdose epidemic that in any given year kills somewhere around 100,000 people in the US. Most of those deaths, 70%, are from fentanyl. But what Trump leaves out is that US customs agents last year only seized about 50 pounds of fentanyl at its northern border with Canada. Compare that to the more than 20,000 pounds, almost 10,000 kilos of fentanyl seized at the southern border with Mexico.
Canada is responsible for less than 1% of the illegal fentanyl that is going into the United States, and it's responsible for less than 1% of the illegal migration into the United States.
Even the Canadian government seemed to question if Trump's tariffs on Canada were ever actually about border security at all.
It also is perhaps just an excuse, frankly, for the president to move forward with the tariffs. And if that's the case, then there is no satisfying the president.
And that's obviously a concern we have.
But what a focus on fentanyl does allow when the claim is about how it is endangering lives, threatening the fabric of society, about transnational cartels and a public health crisis and a national emergency. This is what gives Trump a free hand to impose tariffs at all, in spite of a decades-old series of free trade agreements promising to do no such thing.
You need an emergency that you can sell to the American people. A fentanyl crisis does that. It's simply been a means to an objective, which was to gain tariff authority.
So what kind of economic deal might Trump be looking for? Well, there are two broad possibilities that get the most attention. Here's the first.
Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore.
This trade deficit is a nod to the trade imbalance between Canada and the US.
The United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world.
Trump is unhappy that Americans spend more on Canadian goods and services than Canadians spend on American goods and services. He believes this amounts to the US subsidizing
Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year.
By the tune of about $200 billion a year.
Between $100 billion and $200 billion a year.
Trump doesn't really ever explain where he gets his numbers from. Like, it's hard to know if he thinks this is the size of the trade deficit or if this includes other things like US military spending, from which Canada benefits. But The American trade deficit with Canada is about $40 billion US. And many experts say that's not a problem.
There's nothing inherently good or bad about a trade surplus or a deficit. The United States has had a trade deficit pretty much since the end of the Second World War. Why is that? Because they're richer than any other country, so they buy more stuff.
And consider this, the US's $40 billion deficit with Canada pales in comparison to its trade deficit with many other countries. Just look at how much more the US buys from China each year, for example. That gap, more than $250 billion.
Canada only accounts for about 5% of the overall US deficit just in terms of traded goods. It's not even in the top 5 countries that have a larger surplus.
So this doesn't seem to explain why Trump came to the very brink of initiating a trade war against Canada. A more compelling reason might be what tariffs themselves can accomplish.
America will be a manufacturing nation once again.
Yes, maybe it's not about punishing Canadian industry so much as it is about giving an advantage to American industry. Because, let's say, I make chopsticks for left-handed people. In Canada, I have a whole factory that makes these left-handed chopsticks, and normally I sell these chopsticks to an American supplier for $1 a pair. But with a 25% tariff, that company now has to pay $1.25, and nobody really wants to pay that. So instead of potentially losing business, I might decide to move production to the US, get a whole factory full of Americans making left-handed chopsticks, which creates jobs and lowers prices, which means I can sell more. Win-win. Except
one thing to bear in mind is a majority of our imports are actually intermediate goods or inputs into production.
Yes, Canada sends things to the US, which it then uses to make things, because trying to do it all itself would be catastrophically expensive. And I'll give you an example with Canada's single largest export to the US, oil. Many American refineries aren't actually set up to process American oil. They've long been geared towards heavy crude, as opposed to lighter shale, which American drillers have found more recently. But you know who produces exactly the kind of heavy crude oil America needs? You guessed it. The US buys the majority, around 60% of the crude oil it imports, from Canada.
That commodity is not putting Americans out of work. It's putting Americans to work.
Putting Americans to work because there is an entire industry built around the importation of heavy Canadian crude and all the American workers who process and refine that oil into useful, saleable things: gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. The US could retool all of its refineries and completely reinvent its supply chain, but that's expensive.
Oil and gas is probably one of the best examples of how something that is responsible for a huge trade deficit is actually creating tens of thousands of jobs in the US.
There are lots of other examples too. Car manufacturing is spread out all across North America, even if a car itself might have its final assembly in the US. Steel and aluminum, Canada's a top supplier, and the US then uses those materials in construction, aerospace, you name it.
While we might succeed in expanding production of some of the things that we would have imported, it's going to come at the expense of some of the things that we would have naturally been good at making. So I think it falls apart quite quickly.
There's one other thing I think is worth mentioning that could go some distance in explaining Trump's grand plan. And it was a moment during his inauguration, which maybe you heard and then wondered, what was that all about?
We will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs.
Renaming North America's highest mountain from Denali to McKinley takes on new significance when you understand that McKinley was the last Republican president to resist the idea of income tax.
We had no income tax. The income tax came in 1913.
Income tax, you know what it is, but let me just add, it is intended to force millionaires and billionaires to pay more to the government than everyone else. Trump wants to cut income taxes.
We will end all taxes on overtime.
Are going to pass the largest tax cut in American history.
It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before.
And the connection to tariffs? That's how you start to pay for those cuts.
Donald Trump, when he campaigned, he made a lot of big promises to Americans that are going to cost a lot of money. He sees tariffs as a way to fund some of his domestic agenda.
You know, historically, there was a period where tariffs were actually the single biggest source of revenue for the U.S. government. Trump is a fan of this period.
You know, the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking.
But one modern-day obstacle is the simple fact that there are only so many things you can slap tariffs on. Total U.S. imports in 2023 stood at $3.83 trillion. So you could start taxing those goods. But taxable income in the U.S., that's well in excess of $20 trillion each year. And the government's take on that, both individual and corporate income taxes combined, they account for almost $3 trillion in federal revenue every year. That's a huge line item. Tariffs, at least in their current form, don't come anywhere close to matching that.
This is significant revenues, but it's nowhere near enough for the whole wish list of things that Trump has pledged to do with it.
So where does this leave us? A bit where we started, actually, because none of this is real until Trump makes it real. We haven't even talked about the complete renegotiation of free trade in North America, the biggest deal Trump signed in his first term that he now also seems unhappy with.
Canada's been very tough on oil, on energy. They don't allow our farm products in, essentially. They don't allow a lot of things in, and we allow everything to come in. It's been a one-way street.
But no matter what Trump might do next, we can speak to what Trump has already done. And that is to reshape America's closest alliances, to make clear to countries like Canada and Mexico that they should take American priorities seriously, or else risk serious economic harm, a hit to the relationship that the U.S. can tolerate far longer than they can.